They forced Rowan Hale to clean the helipad in front of hundreds of guests, all because his worn jacket made him look like a maintenance worker who had wandered into the wrong ceremony. Evangeline Crestwood, CEO of Wexford Aeronautics, told the single father to make himself useful and stay out of the way of her defense contract signing. He took the mop without a word. Minutes later, 3 military helicopters descended in formation toward the very surface he had been ordered to scrub. A general stepped out, walked past every executive on the rooftop, and extended his hand toward the man still holding the mop. "We came for you, Commander Hale. If you want to see the reversal that left the powerful speechless, stay with this story until the very end. And subscribe so you never miss what comes next." The Wexford Aeronautics building stood 40 stories above the financial district, its rooftop dressed in white signage and temporary lighting for what the company's communications team had called the most consequential aerospace signing of the decade. Below the wide banner that bore the Wexford name, a freshly installed helipad gleamed under the June sun, its surface recently painted, and its perimeter lined with sleek crowd barriers that separated a crowd of journalists, defense officials, and investors from a smaller inner circle of executives in tailored suits. Evangeline Crestwood had spent 6 months engineering this moment. The formal announcement of a $1.2 billion contract with the Department of Defense, built around a rescue helicopter line that would carry an avionics stabilization system called the Aegis Vector, and she intended for every camera on that rooftop to capture her at the center of it. The screens positioned along the venue's perimeter already displayed looping animations of helicopters cutting through storm clouds, bearing the phrase, "Safety Redefined," and most of the guests who read it had no reason to doubt it. Calder Vaughn, the company's chief operating officer, circulated through the crowd in a charcoal suit, shaking hands with senators' aides and nodding to generals with the confident looseness of a man who believed the most dangerous moment of his day had already passed. Rowan Hale arrived at the building's guest entrance at 11:27 in the morning, stepping out of a 10-year-old pickup truck that the parking attendant waved to the far end of the lot before he could say a word. He wore a plain navy suit that he had last pressed for a school awards ceremony, and, over it, the weathered flight jacket from his old aviation rescue unit, pale olive. The right shoulder patch faded to the point where only the outline of its insignia was still legible. He carried no briefcase, no phone visible, and nothing that looked, to Pierce Larkin standing behind the check-in desk, like a reason to let him through. Pierce had managed this building's event protocols for 11 years and believed he had become fluent in the language of importance, reading it in shoes, watches, the cut of a collar, and the particular way a person's eyes moved when they expected to be recognized. He read Rowan once, from jacket to worn leather boots, and made his decision before the first word was exchanged. Rowan presented the printed invitation, which bore the seal of the Aviation Safety Command and his name beneath a department classification header, and Pierce studied it the way a man studies a document he has already decided is insufficient. The guest list on his tablet showed no Rowan Hale, a fact that Calder Vaughn had ensured 3 days earlier, quietly removing the entry and marking it as a duplicate error. And Pierce announced that without a confirmed name, Rowan would need to wait in the service corridor adjacent to the venue. Rowan asked Pierce to contact the event coordinator to verify the invitation's serial code, and Pierce replied that the coordinator was managing VIP arrivals and was not available for walk-ins, which was the word he chose. Rowan did not argue. He stepped back from the desk, turned toward the rooftop access stairwell that a maintenance worker had left propped open, and walked up it. He emerged onto the rooftop at the edge of the crowd, and within 90 seconds, Evangeline Crestwood saw him. She was mid-sentence with a defense industry journalist when her gaze drifted toward the stairwell door and found the flight jacket, and her expression moved through recognition so quickly that it was visible only to anyone watching her face, rather than her words. She and Rowan had spent 14 months working in the same technical review rooms before their falling out, and she knew his silhouette the same way she knew the shape of a legal clause she had spent weeks trying to bury. She finished her sentence without missing a beat and did not approach him, choosing instead to let the misunderstanding Pierce had already established remain in place, because a man without a name on the list was a man she did not have to address, and a man she did not have to address could not stand at the podium beside her when the cameras turned. She had imagined several versions of how Rowan might reappear in her life. She had not imagined this one, where he was already on her rooftop before she had the chance to have him turned away with a phone call. Rowan, meanwhile, had walked to the edge of the helipad's cleared perimeter and was looking at the surface with the particular stillness of someone whose attention had been captured by something invisible to everyone else. Near the northeastern quadrant, where the perimeter lights met the landing zone markers, a panel of grooved metal was sitting approximately 4 millimeters higher than its surrounding surface, a gap too subtle for a guest to notice and too significant for a pilot to be indifferent about. He crouched briefly, pressed 2 fingers to the panel's edge, and felt it shift. Evangeline arrived at his side without announcement, looked at the jacket for a fraction longer than a glance, and said 4 words that were framed as an offer but carried the weight of a command. "If you want to stay." A small crew of service staff was moving along the helipad's outer perimeter, collecting wayward napkins and realigning the crowd barriers before the aerial demonstration that Evangeline had promised would conclude the morning program. She watched Rowan straighten from his crouch near the edge of the landing zone and turned to indicate the service cart parked beside the stairwell access door, where a mop and a yellow bucket waited beside cleaning supplies that had been left by the morning maintenance team. She told him that someone had tracked in hydraulic fluid from the mechanical level, and that if he had any intention of remaining on the rooftop, he should make himself useful, and she said it loudly enough that the 3 guests standing within earshot could hear every word of it. Calder stepped into the radius of the conversation, wearing a very slight smile that he kept directed at the ground, and Pierce, who had trailed Rowan up the stairwell, stood back near the service cart with the expression of a man who believed a situation was resolving itself in the correct direction. A young woman from the catering staff started to move toward the mop, sensing the misdirection, but Evangeline raised 1 finger without looking at her, and the woman stopped. The message was specific. This task was not being reassigned. This task was being assigned to him for an audience, and the point of the assignment was not cleanliness. Rowan looked at the mop, then at the helipad surface, then picked up the mop. He rolled the bucket to the edge of the hydraulic stain near the center of the pad and began working, and the crowd that had noticed the brief exchange mostly concluded that the situation was self-explanatory. A maintenance subcontractor, perhaps, who had shown up in the wrong clothes and been redirected to the task he was presumably there to complete. Maris Cole, standing 20 feet back at the edge of the media cluster, watched him move across the helipad and felt a different conclusion forming. She had spent a year and a half working in the technical certification division under Rowan before his removal from the Aegis Vector project, and she recognized the way he moved across a landing surface. Not the movement of a person cleaning, but the movement of a person reading, the mop's path tracing a deliberate grid that corresponded to the inspection points on a standard helipad safety checklist. She had last seen him conduct a full surface review in the rain at the flight test facility in Nevada, and it had looked exactly like this. Near the northeastern quadrant, Rowan paused, set the mop aside, and lifted the loose panel with one hand, examining the conduit housing beneath it. What he found was an inspection hatch that had been closed without its locking mechanism engaged, a length of signal wire running along a routing bracket that had been reversed during installation, and two of the four bolts securing the perimeter navigation light housing replaced with fasteners that were 3 millimeters shorter than specification required. The loose panel itself, under the rotor wash of an incoming helicopter, would generate enough lift force to leave the surface at approximately 60 miles per hour and travel in the direction of least resistance, which, given the wind pattern, was directly into the tail rotor approach corridor. He took a nylon cable tie from the inside pocket of his flight jacket, which he had there because he was a person who always had a nylon cable tie in his jacket, and secured the panel's near edge to the anchor ring beside it. He straightened and asked Pierce, who was still nearby, when the last formal safety certification on the pad had been conducted. Pierce told him that maintenance workers did not have access to certification schedules, and Rowan did not correct the assumption. He continued to the next inspection quadrant. Evangeline was at the podium by then, describing the Aegis vector system for the cameras in language that positioned every engineering decision as the product of her executive leadership, and in the distance, beneath her words, came the first low rhythmic pulse of rotors. He looked at the perimeter crowd and told them, with no particular urgency, that everyone standing within 12 feet of the landing zone edge should step back. Evangeline interrupted herself at the podium, located him on the pad, and told the event security team that the maintenance worker was disrupting the ceremony and needed to be escorted to the stairwell before the aircraft arrived. Two guards started toward him as the sound of the helicopters moved from distant to present to overhead. There was not one aircraft. There were three, arriving in a staggered echelon formation that was not the loose, informal approach of a demonstrator aircraft, but the tight, deliberate spacing of a military flight team operating under a coordinated brief. The crowd on the rooftop looked up and then looked at the stage, expecting Evangeline to acknowledge them the way a host acknowledges an effect she arranged, and she moved quickly to the center position in front of the podium with the instinct of someone who had never once been caught in the wrong position for a camera. She lifted her chin, squared her shoulders, and waited for the lead aircraft to cross the perimeter. Rowan had reached the eastern edge of the helipad, where the two security guards caught him by each arm, and he looked up at the approaching formation, and then at the loose conduit housing he had not yet been able to reach. He told the guards that if the lead aircraft came in on the standard approach vector, the secondary wash from the tail rotor would come directly over the unfastened housing, and he said it with the flatness of someone reciting a measurement, not making a threat. One of the guards looked at the other. They both looked at the approaching lead helicopter. Neither of them let go of his arms, but neither of them pulled him toward the stairwell either. He had found the emergency communications panel near the pad's utility housing 3 minutes earlier and recognized the model, having specified a version of it for 4 different installations in his time with the Aviation Safety Command. He had keyed a short warning transmission to the approaching formation: lateral northeast hazard, low confidence anchor, approach on modified vector, and the lead pilot, who was qualified under protocols that took those transmissions as binding, regardless of source, had adjusted the final approach heading by 11 degrees. The 3 aircraft settled onto the pad in sequence, the wash from their rotors curling over the loose housing without engaging it, and when the rotor noise dropped to idle, the silence that followed was the particular kind that comes after something did not happen. General Everett Knox stepped out of the lead aircraft in full dress uniform, followed by 2 aides carrying hard-sided cases and a 4-person technical team in flight suits. He was 58, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had been carved into its current expression by decades of being the person whose word ended arguments. Evangeline stepped forward to meet him, extending her hand with the practiced warmth of someone welcoming a partner, and General Knox shook it briefly, the way a person shakes a hand when their eyes are already focused somewhere else. He moved past her. He walked across the helipad in the direction of the two security guards and the man they were holding by each arm, and when he was 6 feet away, the guards released Rowan without being asked. Knox extended his hand, and Rowan took it, and the handshake was not a greeting between equals in the way that social handshakes are. It was a formal gesture, specific and structured, the kind that carries institutional meaning between two people who share a history with a command. "Commander Hale," Knox said, at a volume the nearest microphone did not need to work hard to capture. The rooftop went quiet enough that people at the far edge turned to see what they had missed. Knox explained the three-part mission to the crowd without addressing the crowd. His tone was that of a man briefing a room that happened to contain an audience. One aircraft had come to transport Rowan to the Aegis Vector Test Facility, where a production batch of the rescue helicopter line had begun showing a stabilization anomaly that matched the failure mode Rowan had flagged in his original certification rejection 3 years earlier. The second aircraft carried a technical investigation team authorized to secure and image all data systems relating to the Aegis Vector program. The third aircraft would accompany the prototype that, as of 40 minutes ago, the Aviation Safety Command had determined was being operated outside its registered program parameters. Evangeline said that Rowan's advisory status with the command had ended when his employment with Wexford was terminated. Knox said that it had not, and that Rowan's civilian advisory contract had been continuously active, which she would have known if she had read the program documentation rather than the summary Calder-Vaughan had prepared for her. He then asked, to the rooftop in general and to no one specific, who had assigned the command's senior aviation advisor to clean a helipad. No one answered. Rowan looked down at the northeastern quadrant of the surface and said, with the same quiet economy he had used for everything else that morning, that no aircraft would be departing from this pad until a full safety inspection was completed and documented. He was not asking. The inspection took 40 minutes, and Evangeline spent most of them arguing with Calder at a volume low enough for discretion and high enough for the nearest row of guests to follow the general shape of the disagreement. Pierce Larkin had gone very still near the stairwell door, his tablet pressed flat against his leg, the face of a man reviewing his decisions in fast forward. Rowan and the technical team from the third aircraft worked the helipad quadrant by quadrant, and what they documented went significantly beyond the loose panel and the misrouted wire. The inspection hatch that had been closed without locking revealed a conduit array where 3 routing paths had been swapped from their specified positions. Not an installation error, but a deliberate substitution that placed lower-rated wire in the high-heat corridor nearest the exhaust path. The bolt gauge discrepancy on the navigation light housing turned out to extend to 11 of the 24 anchor points across the primary and secondary landing zones, suggesting the hardware had been sourced from a non-compliant supplier, and the difference buried in a line item substitution on the procurement record. Pierce had signed the certification of compliance for this helipad 2 weeks earlier, and the certification form listed a full structural and systems review. He had not conducted one. He had signed the form because Calder had sent it to his inbox at 4:40 on a Friday afternoon with a note that said sign and return. Rowan removed the loose panel and laid it flat on the surface where the crowd could see it, and beside it he placed the reversed conduit housing, and beside that he set the 4 underspec bolts in a short row. Evangeline called this theater. She said a loose fastener did not constitute a systemic failure, and that Rowan was using a maintenance discrepancy to manufacture a crisis that would allow him to sabotage a contract he had spent 3 years resenting. Knox asked to see the Helipad's certification file. Calder opened a document on his own tablet and handed it over. A multi-page PDF bearing an electronic signature attributed to Maris Cole, certifying the pad compliant across all structural, electrical, and systems criteria. Maris, who had been standing at the edge of the media area since Knox's arrival, walked forward when her name was spoken. She said she had not signed the final version of that document. She said her signature appeared on a draft she had submitted with 7 outstanding items flagged for remediation, and that the final certification, which removed all 7 flags and appended her name, had been generated from her account while she was on leave. Rowan had suspected the signature when he read it. The document carried a software certification hash corresponding to a version of the compliance platform that had been recalled and replaced 18 months earlier, which meant the signature had been generated in a decommissioned environment and backdated. Knox told the investigation team to begin imaging all server infrastructure in the building. He then told the assembled guests that the $1.2 billion contract had not, in the legal and technical sense, come into effect. The contract's final execution clause required 3 conditions to be met before the government's commitment became binding. Rowan's written confirmation that the current production version of the Aegis Vector system met the original safety specification, his approval of the flight control integration, and his certification of the pilot training protocol. None of those conditions had been fulfilled because Rowan had not been asked to fulfill them. Evangeline had scheduled the signing ceremony for a contract that could not yet be signed, calculating that the presence of cameras, military personnel, and $1 billion of implied momentum would make the missing certification feel like a formality that everyone would agree to treat as complete. Rowan had no intention of treating it as a formality. He said he would not sign anything until the system was tested under its full original specification. The investors in the back row began checking their phones. Evangeline looked across the rooftop at the man who had just cost her the afternoon, the ceremony, and possibly the quarter, and something behind her expression shifted from performance into the kind of calculation that only happens when a person realizes the room they thought they controlled has different walls than they remembered. A specialist from the investigation team opened the primary server cabinet near the building's mechanical access, queried the contract database, and displayed the current digital record of the agreement on a secure tablet. It showed Rowan Hale's electronic signature in the final approval field, dated 3 days prior. Rowan looked at it for a moment. Then he said, quietly and without particular emphasis, that he had never signed that document. Evangeline pivoted with the speed of someone who had rehearsed the move without knowing she would need it so soon. She told the assembled crowd that Rowan was a disgruntled former contractor who had spent 3 years looking for leverage to reinsert himself into a program from which he had been removed for performance and attitude, and that his claim of a forged signature was the latest maneuver in a campaign to damage a company and a defense program that employed thousands of people. Her communications team, which had been standing by the press area since morning with pre-loaded materials, began distributing a folder that contained a termination summary describing Rowan's removal from the Wexford program as a result of persistent obstruction and an inability to meet deliverable timelines. They also distributed a short video clip showing Rowan in a heated exchange inside a conference room, voice raised, documents spread across a table. The clip was 42 seconds long and ended abruptly. What it did not contain was the 12 minutes of footage that preceded it. The 12 minutes in which Rowan had presented 3 separate modeling simulations showing altitude misread scenarios under the system's modified parameters. and the 10 minutes in which Evangeline had told him, in direct language, that the simulations were not relevant to the commercial deployment timeline. Calder had trimmed the clip personally, and he had been confident, until approximately 45 minutes ago, that the original recording no longer existed on any accessible storage. Several members of the board who were present on the rooftop took the folder and read it, and one of them, a man named Franklin Oates, who had been on the Wexford board for 8 years, and who prided himself on the breadth of his operational skepticism, said that this seemed like a matter for an independent review before any further decisions were made. Evangeline said there was nothing to review. 2 more board members said nothing, which in context meant the same thing as Oates. Sterling Wexford, who was 81 miles away at a medical facility where he attended weekly monitoring appointments for a cardiac condition, was watching the rooftop proceedings through a secure video link that his personal assistant had established the moment reports of military aircraft began coming through the news. He had said nothing during the exchange, but had been visibly leaning forward in his chair since Knox walked across the helipad toward Rowan. He now asked, through the link, for the investigation to be allowed to proceed, and for no additional actions to be taken on the contract until he had reviewed the complete technical record personally. Evangeline said that Sterling's role as honorary chairman did not extend to operational decisions. Sterling said that his role as the signatory on the original Aegis Vector Technology licensing agreement did. Rowan, having already provided the investigation team with the recovery codes for the Aegis Vector Source Archive, had turned his attention to a different matter. Maris had approached him while Evangeline was speaking and told him in a low voice that a prototype aircraft, the development test bed that contained the only complete copy of the Aegis Vector flight log library under its production parameters, had been moved from the secure hangar at the company's test facility that morning under a maintenance transfer notation that listed no destination. The transfer had not gone through standard logistics. Rowan asked the investigation team's lead officer to pull the radar track for the prototype's transponder, and the lead officer did, and the display showed the aircraft moving southwest at cruise altitude toward an uncontrolled private airstrip registered to a holding company under the Crestwood family name. The prototype had left the ground at 8:50 that morning, approximately 2 hours before the ceremony began, and was 40 minutes from landing. 3 years before the ceremony, in the spring of what had been the last year of Rowan's formal employment with Wexford Aeronautics, he had spent 6 weeks trying to explain to a series of increasingly senior executives why removing the Aegis Vector's redundant altitude cross-check layer would produce an unacceptable risk outcome. The system had been designed with 3 independent data paths for altitude confirmation: primary radar altimetry, secondary barometric calibration, and a tertiary inertial reference that activated automatically when the first 2 disagreed by more than a defined threshold. What Evangeline's engineering timeline called for, in order to reduce unit production cost and shorten the certification path, was the elimination of the tertiary layer, which her team described in internal documents as a redundant failsafe in conditions that could be managed by pilot training and procedural compliance. Rowan had built the tertiary layer specifically because pilot training and procedural compliance were insufficient in the degraded visibility search and rescue scenarios the helicopter was designed to operate in, and he had the modeling data to demonstrate it. He presented the data. He presented it again. He rescheduled 3 meetings and drove 400 miles for a review session that was canceled 2 hours before he arrived. When Calder sidelined him from the project in a meeting attended by 2 board members, and a document that listed Rowan's objections as evidence of scope creep and ego-driven obstruction, Sterling Wexford was in his 4th week of cardiac treatment and receiving daily briefings through the filter of a communications team that Evangeline had, at that point, been managing for 6 months. Maris had been brought into the final certification process as a technical witness, a formality in Wexford's compliance protocol that was supposed to provide independent validation. What she had actually provided was a series of increasingly specific questions about the modified system parameters, and when those questions were not answered, she had submitted her certification draft with 7 open items and gone on leave, expecting the process to pause until the items were resolved. Instead, her name had appeared on a completed certification 2 weeks later, and when she returned from leave and confronted Calder, he had told her that her signature had been applied to a document she had technically already submitted, and that any discrepancy was the product of a version control error that had already been logged and corrected. She had not believed him. She had also not filed a formal objection, because she had a daughter starting college in the fall and a mortgage and 12 years of professional history with this company, and because the person she would have needed to report the discrepancy to was Calder Vaughn. That silence had lasted 3 years and 2 months, and it had ended on this rooftop at the moment Knox had called Rowan by his rank, and Evangeline had visibly flinched. Now, with the investigation team's authority established and the prototype's location confirmed, the full weight of what Maris had been carrying for 3 years had somewhere to go. She provided a sworn statement to the military investigator, a compact, precise woman named Captain Avery Sloan, who had the habit of writing faster than anyone expected, detailing every instance in which she had been presented with documentation bearing her name that she had not produced, every meeting in which she had been told the safety flags were being managed upstream, and every conversation in which Calder had made it clear that her continued employment was in proximity to her continued discretion. Pierce Larkin, who had been listening from near the stairwell door, asked a junior member of the investigation team in a quiet voice how serious the exposure was for someone who had signed a Helipad certification without conducting the associated inspection. The investigator looked at him for a moment and said, truthfully, that it depended heavily on whether that person was cooperative. Pierce then asked how a person went about being cooperative, and the investigator pointed him toward Captain Sloan. Within 20 minutes, Pierce had delivered to Captain Sloan a chain of internal messages in which Calder had forwarded the certification form with the instruction to sign and return before end of business, accompanied by a note that the physical inspection had already been completed by a contracted maintenance team, whose name Pierce had never before seen or been able to locate in any vendor record. Evangeline, watching the triangulation of testimony close around her from 3 separate directions, called a shareholder meeting for that afternoon, citing an emergency governance concern that required the immediate board to convene without Sterling Wexford's participation. The hangar meeting room was the largest space in the facility, a repurposed aircraft bay with high ceilings and folding chairs arranged in theater rows facing a presentation screen, the kind of room designed to hold large numbers of people who all needed to see the same thing at the same time. Evangeline had chosen it deliberately because it was a room where size created its own authority and where the visual complexity of large-scale financial presentations could be used to move attention away from smaller, more inconvenient specifics. She had spent the 90-minute gap between the rooftop and the meeting preparing a presentation that framed what had happened that morning as a coordinated external attack on Wexford's market position, driven by a combination of Aviation Safety Command, overreach, and personal grievance from a former contractor whose financial instability made him susceptible to manipulation by program competitors. She included a single slide that displayed Rowan's home address in a rural county, his vehicle registration records, and a satellite image of the property, which was a small house on a half-acre lot adjacent to a regional airport. She presented this slide without commentary and allowed the image to speak its intended language about the kind of person who drove a 10-year-old truck to a defense contract signing and wore a jacket that had last been relevant 20 years ago. Rowan stood at the back of the room while she presented it. He said nothing until she finished. Then he said that the value of a safety warning did not change based on the square footage of the person who issued it, and he said it without heat, the way a person states a measurement in a unit that does not require context to be valid. General Knox presented the technical findings that the investigation team had completed in the preceding 2 hours. The modified Aegis Vector Production Code, extracted from the prototype before its arrival at the Crestwood airstrip was intercepted by a lawful administrative hold, showed deliberate removal of the tertiary altitude cross-check, confirmed by version control logs stamped with Calder-Vaughan's administrative credentials. Maris presented the original certification draft alongside the completed version bearing her forged signature. Pierce delivered the message chain. Captain Sloan read a 2-paragraph summary of the flight log data from the prototype that showed the system operating outside its original specification in 12 of the 22 logged test scenarios, including 4 instances of altitude misread that had been resolved only by pilot override rather than automatic fail-safe engagement. Evangeline said that Calder had acted unilaterally, that she had not authorized the code modifications, and that the management chain clearly showed the engineering decisions originating below her authority level. Calder had been sitting 3 rows from the front with the posture of someone who had been planning his exit strategy for the last hour. He opened his email application, attached 4 files, and sent them to Captain Sloan's contact address, which he had been given during his voluntary interview earlier that afternoon. The 4 files were a message thread from Evangeline's executive account, directing the scope of the Aegis vector modification with specific technical parameters, a detailed timeline of the signature generation scheme including the software access log, showing the use of Rowan's archived signature from a document he had submitted 3 years earlier. A side agreement between Evangeline and a private equity fund indicating her intent to sell the Aegis Vector licensing rights to the fund's aviation portfolio at a valuation independent of the government contract, and a draft press release, authored 6 months prior, announcing that Wexford Aeronautics had completed the Aegis Vector program without any contribution from its original developer. Sterling Wexford, who had arranged ground transportation from the medical facility when it became clear that a video link was insufficient for the gravity of what was unfolding, entered the hangar meeting room through the side access door while Evangeline was still processing the fact that Calder had just forwarded those files. Sterling was 71, slower than he had been, and leaning on a cane he had not used 2 years ago, but the particular authority that accumulated in a person who had built something from the ground up over 4 decades had not diminished. He said, before anyone else could speak, that he owed Rowan Hale an accounting that was 3 years overdue, and that he had been given information about Rowan's removal from the Aegis Vector program that he now understood to have been incomplete, selective, and in material respects false. He said he did not expect Rowan to receive this as an apology sufficient to the damage that had been done. He then said that under the original technology development agreement for the Aegis Vector, which had been drawn in the company's founding documents and had not been modified or superseded, Rowan retained a contractual veto right over any transaction that materially altered the system's safety architecture. The agreement had been considered dormant for the last 3 years because Rowan had chosen not to exercise it. The sale of the Aegis Vector licensing rights to any external party at any valuation required his affirmative written consent. Without it, the sale was void. the plan that Evangeline had been constructing for 2 years, and for which she had modified code, forged signatures, staged a ceremony, and maneuvered an 81-year-old founder away from his own governance structures, had been legally impossible from the moment she had conceived it. The board voted to suspend Evangeline pending formal investigation before she had finished formulating her response to Sterling's statement. The vote was not close. Evangeline requested a private word with Rowan before she left the building, and he agreed to 5 minutes in the corridor beside the hangar entrance. She began with the offer she had prepared, licensing royalties at a rate that would represent the largest single payment he had received in his career, a seat on the engineering advisory board, and a private settlement figure that she specified in a way that made clear she expected it to be persuasive. She said that the morning had been professionally regrettable, and that her comments on the rooftop had been made under the pressure of an event she had not expected to be disrupted, and that she believed reasonable people in adversarial positions could still find workable terms. Rowan listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said that he did not consider the morning's events to be primarily about what had been said to him on a rooftop. He said the concern was not that she had handed him a mop. The concern was that she had been willing to put rescue pilots, search and rescue crews, and the people those crews were sent to find into aircraft whose safety architecture she had knowingly degraded, because the timeline and the margin looked better without the layer she had removed. He said that was a decision whose consequences could not be settled privately. The $1.2 billion contract was placed under administrative review, which meant neither canceled nor confirmed but suspended in the careful, bureaucratic space where large decisions go when the ground beneath them turns out to be different from what the architects believed. Rowan submitted a technical recovery proposal to the Aviation Safety Command that was built not around what he wanted, but around what the system required. Restoration of the full 3-layer altitude confirmation architecture, recertification of all production units under the original specification, an independent safety board with authority over any future parameter changes, and retention of all Wexford employees below the director level who had not been party to the fraud, because the people who manufactured the parts, maintained the hangars, and ran the calibration labs had not made the decisions that had brought investigators to their building. The command accepted the proposal as the framework for continued contract negotiations. It took 3 months to confirm, and Rowan spent most of that period in a small conference room at the test facility working through the recertification process, with a team that was, for the first time in 3 years, not being asked to sign anything they had not reviewed. Sterling offered him the interim CEO role the same week the suspension vote concluded. Rowan declined. He said he was not the right person to run the company, and that placing him at its head because of a military background and a vindicated argument was the kind of decision that solved the wrong problem. He accepted the chairmanship of the Independent Safety Board, a position that carried no equity, no executive title, and no authority over anything except the integrity of the certification process. He said that was the job he was actually qualified to do. The board's founding charter, which Rowan drafted and Sterling signed, contained a single operational guarantee. No engineer at Wexford Aeronautics would ever again be asked to sign a document certifying something they had not verified. In the corridor, Evangeline looked at the mop that a maintenance worker had left leaning against the wall near the hangar door. A different mop, a different day, but the same kind of object, and asked if Rowan intended to use one morning of humiliation to dismantle an entire career. He said he did not. He said that her career had been dismantled by the signatures on the documents she had generated, and that those were her signatures and not his mop. 6 months after the ceremony, The new helipad on the Wexford Aeronautics rooftop was completed to a specification that exceeded every requirement the original installation had failed to meet. 112 anchor points, all verified with calibrated torque equipment and independently logged, 3 redundant lighting circuits, sealed conduit housings, and a certification record that took 47 pages to document because every item had been photographed, measured, and signed by the inspector who had personally verified it. The ribbon at the operational acceptance ceremony was not cut by an executive. It was held at each end by a structural engineer and a maintenance technician, which had been Maris Cole's suggestion and which Sterling Wexford had immediately approved. Maris led the independent certification division now, reporting to the safety board rather than to the company's commercial leadership, and the arrangement had already identified 3 discrepancies in a different product line that would have reached production without the structural separation. Pierce had lost his facility management role because the helipad certification he had signed remained a falsified document, regardless of who had pressured him to sign it, but he had cooperated fully with the investigation, and the consequence was administrative rather than criminal, and he had found a position at a smaller building management company where, it was reported by someone who knew someone, he had become considerably more rigorous about site inspections before putting his name on anything. Evangeline and Calder were working through the machinery of legal proceedings that were neither swift nor cinematic, the kind of process that unfolds in conference rooms and produces outcomes measured in years rather than scenes. There were no dramatic moments to describe. There was a process, and it was proceeding. Rowan still lived in the same house near the regional airport. He drove the same truck. Sadie, his daughter, was finishing her junior year at a school whose teachers had no idea what her father did, which was how he had always preferred it. She had attended the acceptance ceremony on the rooftop because he had asked her to, and she had watched the military pilots greet him in a way that clearly meant something she did not fully have the context to interpret. He had told her afterward on the drive home that what mattered about a helicopter was not the ceremony but the landing, and that what mattered about the landing was whether everyone who needed to get home could get home. She had said that was the most him thing he had ever said to her, and he had agreed that it probably was. On the morning of the operational acceptance flight, the first test mission to use the restored full-specification Aegis vector system under live conditions, Rowan arrived on the rooftop before anyone else. He walked the helipad in a grid pattern with a flashlight and a checklist, the same check he had always run, the same one he had run with a mop handle as a pretext on a morning when someone had wanted to make a point about what he was worth. The 3 military helicopters arrived in the same echelon formation as before. Knox stepped out of the lead aircraft and shook Rowan's hand. A young maintenance technician who had been refilling the pad's lighting reservoir knocked his water bucket over, and it spread across the painted surface in a wide, clear fan. The technician looked at Rowan with the expression of someone who has already begun apologizing before they have finished making the mistake. Rowan crouched down, picked up the bucket and helped him clean it up, and Sterling Wexford, who was watching from the edge of the crowd, asked him why he still did that kind of thing himself. Rowan said there was no kind of work that was beneath a person when it helped someone get home safe. Near the stairwell door, a new sign had been mounted at eye level on a panel of brushed aluminum. The words on it had been suggested by Maris Cole and approved by the board unanimously and without revision. Rank does not make a leader. Accountability does. 6 months before, they had forced Rowan Hale to clean this helipad because they believed he was the least important person on the rooftop. On the morning the 3 helicopters came back, no one made that mistake again. But Rowan still knelt down on the same surface, helping a young technician wipe up a spill, because he had never needed a rank, a formation of aircraft, or a general's salute to tell him what his work was worth. He only ever needed to know that when the rotors finally stopped turning, every person aboard had made it back to the ground.
Oh yeah. Fun. What on the map we're in? Hell yeah. Let's get it. Where's I got motion sickness from it and laid down? True. Yeah. For I was like, what the fuck? Welcome in, everybody. Let me just order some food real quick. What's up, Koo? How you doing? And we're gonna keep playing. You thought I was a chef?